Okay, so it's good to see everybody. Thanks so much for being here. Just real quickly, I want to let everybody know I am recovering from having had bronchitis for the second time this year. Earlier this week, so thankfully Carly gave me some water in the last service, and so if I start, I'm okay. You know what I mean? Like, so if I start coughing and I can't stop, don't be alarmed or grossed out too much. So sorry about that. Other than that, I think that's the only disclaimer. Oh no, that's not the only disclaimer I have. The other disclaimer is I have so much material to get through. I have double stuffed this sermon, probably. Ill-advisedly. I probably should have edited it down further, but I just didn't know like what could we cut and have it still make sense. So we are going to cover a lot of ground. We have so much to get to. There will come a point at some point in the throughout the morning where you're thinking, where are we going with this? There's a lot of information and it doesn't really seem to be going anywhere. I promise you, if you hang with me, hopefully it will. If I do my job okay, hopefully it will. If not, I'm really sorry. Hopefully you can buy your time back later. We may or may not get out of here before dinner tonight. If you need to DoorDash something for yourself for lunch, no one's going to judge you for that. I think there's still coffee out there. If you need bathroom breaks throughout, that's fine too. Just wanted to get that out of the way so that you're not like, wow, it's like Monday morning, we're still digging into this. But so I'm going to try really hard to get through as much of this as I can, but I'm going to have to talk fast, which I realize is unusual. So I'm going to have to really accelerate my pace on this one. So there's no time for like cute stories or funny intros or anything like that. I just have to go. So that's what we're going to do. Let's all take a deep breath. Hopefully we're ready to go. So we're looking at a passage from the book of Revelation, definitely the most normal and easily understood book in the entire Bible. So in the book of Revelation, what we have is it's a letter sent to a group of churches in a region of the world at that time known as Asia Minor, what we would refer to modern day as Turkey. And so all of the people living in this time are struggling with questions about what does it look like for us to live with an increasing amount of tension between us and the Roman Empire. Because what this series is what we've been trying to do for the last almost 2 months now, is we've been trying to wrestle with and examine what does it look like for us to interact with power? What does it look like when we have power? What does it look like when somebody else has power? How do we interact with these kinds of things? When there's someone abusing their power, what is our response? What is our posture towards that? So what we're doing now today is we're looking at this passage from Revelation 13, which is going to look bananas at face value, but it all revolves around the notion of, okay, we are living in a system where one person, primarily a guy whose title would have been Caesar, has most of the power, if not all of the power in the known world, and we are at odds with Caesar in lots of different ways, ideologically and in how we practice our lives in a daily way. And so how do we live in a situation where Caesar has an outsized amount of power and there's tension between us and Caesar? That's the whole idea behind the book of Revelation. So Revelation is the writing of someone who is observing this tension and trying to make sense of all of it and then trying to instill some amount of hope into the lives of other people who are also living inside of it. So Revelation is written by a guy named John who is he's living in exile on a Greek island called Patmos. And so John is writing this letter and he's writing it to be sent to these 7 different churches throughout what we now refer to as Turkey, the southern part of that region. So what we find in Revelation, what we now look at and think like, well, this is just bananas, at the time would have been seen as like specifically like metaphorical or poetic kinds of language to try and help people understand what they're going through. Because it's one thing to just describe a thing, right? It's one thing to say there is a system, there is an imbalance of power, this person is abusing their power, and these are all the ways that they're abusing their power. It's a whole other thing for someone with an artistic or a poetic bent to enter that conversation and to begin describing things from that perspective. Because sometimes black and white descriptions of a thing don't really get at what is the effect of this thing. For that, you need a poet. And so what John is doing in Revelation is he's trying to attach metaphorical and poetic language to a thing that is so much bigger than anything that can just be described in black and white terms. So to us, again, thousands of years later, this book, in a lot of ways, makes no sense at face value, and admittedly so. And so what ends up happening is you get lots of, like, conspiracy theories, or you get lots of kind of people sort of speculating over, well, what does this mean? How does this translate to now or whatever? And one of the things we have to remember is we are always reading somebody else's mail. Anytime you're looking at Revelation, you're looking at something that was written to a group of people thousands of years ago in a time and place that was not ours. So it would have made no sense at all. Why would John ever have written something down and sent it to this group of people and said, like, look, this is going to make no sense to you. It's going to seem like I had a weird fever dream and just transcribed it, and it makes no sense to anybody. But thousands of years from now, in a country that doesn't exist yet, it will start to make sense. Who would write that letter? So John, we have to remember, is writing to a group of people who live in a real time and a real place, and he's using language that they would have understood. So what we're trying to do is ask, okay, how would they have heard these words when they received them? So again, lots of metaphorical, poetic language, because again, the black and white description does not capture what's fully going on here. So we're starting in Revelation 13. At the end of Revelation 12, just to kind of get a little bit of setup here, John has been describing something he refers to as the dragon. So the dragon, we find out, represents any sort of evil that exists in the world around us. Again, it's a metaphorical, like how do you describe evil like in intangible form? Well, you ascribe like a creature to it of some sort. And so John uses the image of a dragon to describe this is what it feels like when there is an oppressive evil like cloud hanging over you. This is what it feels like to live under the thumb of Caesar when all Caesar wants to do is press us into the ground. So he uses the image of a dragon to begin that conversation. So in Revelation 13, beginning in verse 1, it says, "The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It, the beast, had," and this is, it's getting weird fast. "It had 10 horns and 7 heads, naturally, with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion." Try drawing that, by the way. "The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority." So already we are 2 verses in, and like, what are you talking? John, what exactly, with all due respect, what exactly have you been smoking? So like, where are we going with all of this? So where does this language come from? So he starts by talking about a beast that came out of the sea. Where does this come from? So John does not make this up. This is not brand new. Hundreds of years prior to the book of Revelation, there was another book from the Hebrew Scriptures, what we refer to as the Old Testament, called Daniel. And Daniel actually, this image of a beast coming out of the sea shows up first in the book of Daniel. Why? Because Daniel is writing about what it looks like to live under the oppressive regime of the Babylonian Empire. So hundreds of years before the Roman Empire has occupied Judea, the people of Israel lived in exile in the Babylonian Empire. So Daniel is writing to people about what does it look like for us to live in this world. So Daniel, one of the images he uses is the image of a beast coming out of the sea. So this is not new. John did not make this up. Daniel is writing to and about people living under the oppression of a different world power. So John is tapping into this other ancient story and this series of images about people who have lived under the oppression of a major world power. So John is pointing back to this other story and saying, even though some things have changed, some things have remained the same. We are still dealing with beasts, is what John is saying. The Daniel story isn't over yet. So in Daniel, the beast coming out of the sea, again, represents the Babylonian Empire. Now, John is using it specifically to talk about the Roman Empire, but not just the Roman Empire in general, a very specific figure in the Roman Empire. And we're going to see what that is in a second. So the beast, he uses several descriptive terms, and so we have to sort of, just to kind of get through, like, why is he describing this beast in these specific terms? So at first, he talks about the beast in terms of, he uses some animal descriptives. So he talks about a leopard, a bear, and a lion. Why these animals? So here's the thing about this. Each of these animals, in their own way, are symbols at this time and in this place of strength and power. First of all, let's start with the lion. The lion was the dominant symbol of the Babylonian Empire. So it was almost like a mascot a little bit. So, and you still see this kind of thing today with various names. Like, we have a bald eagle, you know what I mean? So like, there are times when you will have world powers who will use the image of an animal as a way of saying, this is what we are in the world. Like, our symbolism says something about how we see ourselves. So what the lion is meant to represent to the world in terms of the Babylonian Empire was, as the lion is to the animal world, the Babylonian Empire is to the human world, is the idea here. So, like, in other words, we are the most powerful among powerful beings. So the lion specifically is a representation of a nation with an outsized amount of power and military strength. So then the next couple of animals, or going backwards, we have the leopard and the bear. So there were a handful of gods at this time and in this place that would have been represented by images of various animals. Specifically, Artemis and Dionysus were both represented by animals like leopards and bears. So so these animals would represent not just the human kingdom of the empire, it would also, these other two animals would have represented the world of the gods. So this is all, so all of these images, the leopard, the bear, and the lion, are all about the power of nations, but also the power of the gods. So all of these animals, so if you push it all together, you think like this image makes no sense. Like try and ask a child to draw what's being described here. Like that would be the weirdest looking picture you ever saw. But for John, it makes total sense because he's saying like, yeah, this figure with all this power, he's leveraging the power of empire, but he's also leveraging the power of the gods, at least in his own mind. And so there's also, though, we have images of the thing that just got tossed up there too, with horns, crowns, and a throne. What is this about? So each of these images on their own in ancient literature would have been images that represented some sort of physical, like political power in some sort of way. So any one of these images, like if you had just talked about horns or crowns or a throne, you would have said like, oh, this is someone with some amount of power. To combine all three, what you're saying is, oh, this is someone with an unprecedented amount of power. To push all of these images together and put it all onto one metaphorical figure, what you're saying is the amount of power we're dealing with here is a kind of power we have never seen before in living memory. So the image of the beast in Revelation, this is not, again, if you just take it at face value and literally, it makes no sense. Like, what even are we looking for in this? But if you see it through the image of, or through the lens of poetry and metaphor that people would have seen it in the first century, everyone reading this would have said, like, oh, I see. We're talking about power. We're talking about someone who has leveraged and accumulated so much power that no one, like we have no comparison. There is no modern historical figure that can compare to the amount of power that whatever we're talking about here possesses. So the image of the beast is about someone or something that has acquired an enormous amount of power. So that's 2 verses in so far. So in verse 3, it says, one of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. Now, I didn't go to medical school, but it's my understanding that if you have a fatal head wound, you don't heal from that because the word fatal means you died from it, correct? So what in the world, like this is getting even weirder and weirder. What in the world, if this figure has a fatal head wound, the wound should not have healed. It should just be a fatal head wound, period, right? No, it says, but the wound has healed. And so what in the world is this about? Now, this may sound weird, but that one detail, actually, historians will argue, that is what unlocks what this passage is actually about. This is actually the code. This decodes what the whole passage is getting at, this one little detail, and here's why. So about 30 years before the book of Revelation, so at the time of the book of Revelation, Caesar's a guy named Domitian. 30 years before that, there was a guy named Nero, who was Caesar. It's a statue of Nero. It's not real Nero. It's just a statue. Don't worry. So Nero is often historically seen as the emperor of Rome that really set off and escalated the tension and persecution from the Roman Empire towards specifically Christians. And a lot of times we talk about persecution of Christians and we talk about how there's an assumption that the reason Christians were persecuted in Rome is just because they were following a different God than the Romans followed. That's not necessarily true. Really, the Romans didn't care how many gods you followed as long as you paid your taxes and didn't disrupt the system too bad, as long as you were able to at least verbally acknowledge Caesar as Lord. Like, they were pretty cool about it as long as you paid your taxes and didn't cause too much trouble. So at some point, why were the Christians targeted by Rome? It wasn't because Nero specifically had an axe to grind against Jesus. It was a whole other reason. See, so the Christians were a minority group living inside of the Roman Empire, And there was some amount of tension, and we've talked a lot about that tension already, but there already was some amount of tension between the empire and the Romans for various reasons. Here's how it ratcheted up. At some point during Nero's reign, there was a massive fire that broke out in the city of Rome, and it burned a good chunk of the city. And no one ever determined exactly who started that fire. There were a group of people who were strong critics of Nero that began to circulate a rumor that Nero had actually started the fire himself. Now, historically, that's probably not true. But the thing that matters is that a lot of people at the time believed that it was true. And so I don't know if you've ever run an entire empire on your own, but if you were running an empire, it would be good if the people who were following you didn't think you tried to burn it down. So Nero realizes, like, politically, this is bad for me. I need to not have people thinking that I started this fire. So Nero then has to find another group of people to lay the blame on. So he sees this other group of people, this group of people who already doesn't quite fit in with the rest of the empire. It's the Christians. And so what Nero begins to say is, you know who really resents your way of life and is trying to overthrow Rome? It's the Christians. They've been talking about it for a long time. The Christians are trying, who else but the Christians would have started this fire? So Nero begins to lay the blame on the Christian. So Nero uses people's fear of a minority group of people living in their midst to scapegoat them and in order to gain public support for himself. Not a thing you could ever see thousands of years later today, but that's a thing that happened long time ago, is that sometimes people would use the fear of minority groups in order to gain public support. Like, just a weird thing that only happened one time ever. So that is a thing that Nero did in order to deflect the blame of the fire on him. So Nero begins to really ratchet up the Christian persecution as out of that. It is generally believed that Nero is directly responsible for the execution of both Peter and Paul, early followers of Jesus. And so there are lots and lots of stories about some pretty horrific and cruel things that Nero did as a result of his hatred and growing animosity towards this group of people. So Nero, 30 years later, when he's not even the emperor anymore, Nero is, in the minds of the people receiving this, he is the person most responsible for the pain and suffering that this whole group of people has caused. Nero, as an image, is sort of shorthand for this is what it looks like when it gets really, really bad. And so another little detail, and so you were probably sitting there thinking, like, so what does any of this have to do with a fatal head wound? Thank you for asking. So towards the end, or right at the end of Nero's reign, basically he begins to completely lose the support of not just the public, but of the Senate. And so he wakes up one night in his palace and all of his bodyguards have vanished. Not a great sign. So he realizes pretty quickly, because he's not totally an idiot, he realizes, like, oh, the reason my bodyguards are gone is because somebody's coming to get me. And Nero understands that if he is taken alive and allowed to be publicly executed, nobody knows better than Nero how bad Roman public executions can be. So Nero decides, I will not be taken alive. So Nero, along with the help of one of his personal attendants, takes a blade and takes his own life by stabbing himself in the neck. So Nero dies as a result of a knife wound to the neck. So in ancient literature, if you were recording deaths and wounds, any wound that occurs above the shoulders would have been classified as a head wound. So you have Nero, who has been known as, like, the dominant enemy of this group of people. And so now you have John describing a beast with a fatal head wound, and he says the head wound has been healed. What's that about? Well, here's why. Because 30 years later, long after Nero has died, a rumor begins to circulate that Nero has secretly come back to life, and that's why the tension between the Christians and the Romans has gotten so bad, because Nero, like zombie Nero, has resurrected from the dead and is pulling the strings and targeting Christians. So everybody has this, like, real, like, tangible fear of zombie Nero. And now today we realize, like, that's obviously that is not a thing that actually had happened. But imagine you were living in the first century. You were one of the first or second generation of people who, like, your whole faith foundation started with a guy resurrecting from the dead, right? And so is it really that far-fetched to assume that this group of people also might have thought, like, well, if Jesus could resurrect from the dead, couldn't Jesus' mortal enemy Nero also have resurrected from the dead? Why not? So lots of people believe that Nero had a fatal head wound and that the head wound was healed. So I've totally lost my place. There's so much to get to. So around the time the Revelation I'm sorry. Okay, so I got to collect my thoughts. So historians look at what John has to say here in John 13 about the beast with the fatal head wound, and the head wound's been healed. Historians look at that and say, oh, of course, it's Nero. Like, who else could this be? It's Nero. So the question then becomes, so why does the beast come from the sea? Well, if you lived in Asia Minor, this is the farthest east that the Roman Empire stretches. So if you wanted to go to Rome, you would have to go west by boat. And if someone from Rome wants to get to you, they would also have to come by sea. So the only way to travel to and from Rome, from this place, is by sea. So John talks about a beast with a fatal head wound that comes from the sea. The whole thing is about the emperor of Rome. The whole thing is pointing back at Nero and then whoever follows Nero in that line. So, and then, interestingly, there's actually two beasts in the story because one just isn't enough. So if you look at Revelation 13, if you jump down to verse 11, he writes, then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. So this one doesn't come from the sea, it comes from the earth. It said he says, it had two horns, the second beast, two horns like a lamb, but spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose fatal head wound had been healed. Again, like saying, like, by the way, if you haven't forgotten, we are talking about Nero still. So he says, so there's a second beast, but the second beast's whole job is to make sure people are appropriately worshiping the first beast. So what is that? Well, historians believe, generally, that John is describing somebody local because he comes from the land and not the sea. So probably, most likely, he's describing what would have been at the time the local ruler of the region, who was a guy who lived in the city of Pergamum, which is one of the 7 cities that John is writing to. So this is the guy that Caesar has set up basically as his puppet in the region. We've talked about this a lot, but if you want to run a global empire, you can't be everywhere at once, then you have to have people set up that you trust will do what you want them to do. And so he's got all of these like little puppet kings and governors set up all over the Roman Empire. And so there was a guy in Pergamum whose job it was to make sure people were appropriately worshiping and showing honor to Caesar. So also, by the way, this is my favorite thing that I learned in all of the research doing this. This is the one detail that I'm like, no way. Like this surely this did not happen. I've like triple checked it. It definitely did. So it is well known that the governor of this region, this guy who lived in Pergamum, would use an elaborate system of tubes and wiring to make it seem like the statues of the gods, because specifically in Pergamum, there were the whole city was littered with statues of the gods, which also included all of the Caesars who had died prior to that point. So the governor of Pergamum had somebody set up a system of tubes and wires that would make it seem like the gods or the statues were audibly speaking to the people. So thousands of years before Walt Disney had the idea for the Pirates of the Caribbean, this guy is like, I've got an idea. I'm gonna make all these statues look like they're singing and dancing or talking or whatever. And he's Wizard of Ozing this whole thing. And pay no attention to the governor of Pergamum behind the curtain, doing this whole bit as a way of trying to manipulate the people and say, see, even the gods can see you. They see you when you're sleeping. And so they are fully aware of what you're doing. So you better watch out or the gods are gonna come for you. And one of those statues would have been a statue of Nero, the one I showed you before. So what does this have to do with anything? Look at verse 14. Because of the signs the second beast, was given to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast was given power to, watch this, give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. What is he talking about? He's talking about this whole elaborate pulley system of we're making it look like the gods are speaking, that the long dead Caesars can still interact with the people and still speak to the people. Clearly, John is writing about a specific thing that's happening in this time and in this place. Also, a thing to know is there was in one of the cities that John is writing to, a city called Ephesus, there was a marketplace called the Agora. So this is a picture of the Agora as it stands today, the ruins of the Agora. So here's the thing about the Agora. Remember how I said that this region is kind of the furthest east you can go and still be in the Roman Empire. Well, the same was true in the other direction, which is to say anybody who needed to interact with the Roman Empire, specifically for like economic or trade reasons, would have to come to this space and buy and sell and trade in, like, to be able to buy and sell and trade in the Roman Empire. This is the closest you could get to home and still and be in the Roman Empire. So in Ephesus, in the Agora, there was this massive marketplace. And anybody who wanted to trade from the east to the west in either direction had to do so inside the Agora. Now, in order to buy and sell and trade in the Agora, there were a couple of things you had to do. First, you had to go, there was a specifically designated spot inside the Agora where you would go and you would proclaim Caesar is Lord. And you would make an offering. And once you had proclaimed that Caesar was Lord and made your offering, they would give you a mark, either on the back of your hand or somewhere on your face, probably your forehead. And they would say, okay, now you have this mark, which gives you the ability. It's like, if you go into like a concert venue and they put a wristband on you, it basically says like it's okay for you to be here. So the mark was a way of saying to all of the other merchants in the territory or in the Agora, this person has been cleared by Caesar and they can buy and sell and trade inside the Agora. So they would give you this mark after making the offering, and you would be able to buy and sell and trade. Can you guess what they called that mark? The mark of the beast. Yeah. So this is how they would refer to that. So look at Revelation 13, verse 16. It says, the beast, also forced people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, so they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. So when we start talking, again, this goes to like how many of us have heard like conspiracy theories or like wild speculation about like credit cards or like smartphones or whatever. It's the mark of the beast. Like, no, this is a thing from thousands. This is an actual thing from thousands of years ago that people would talk about when they would go into and out of the Agora. This is a real time and a real place. It's a real thing that they would say. So the whole passage is about all of these images that speak to like how is this thing interacting with power. Then if we finish the chapter in verse 18, and it says, this calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. Now, I think we're all familiar with 666, right? Like, we've all seen movies. We've all, we've all dressed up for Halloween. Like, we all know, like, what 666, like, what people think that is. And there's, again, all kinds of speculation as to what this means and where it comes from. Let's go ahead and let the air out of that a little bit too. So there's an ancient interpretive tool that Hebrew writers would often use. It's called gematria. This is not the first group of people who discovered this. It's basically a cipher. It's a numerical coding system. And how it worked was that each letter of the Hebrew alphabet was assigned a numerical value. And so if you wanted to send like sensitive information from point A to point B, but you didn't want that information to be decoded by, say, a hostile foreign power who might kill you if they get a hold of it and understand what you're trying to say, you would use gematria as a way to sort of encode what you're trying to say so that only people who also know the code can read it. So what gematria would do is they would use numbers to assign shorthand value to each of the Hebrew letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So if you're trying to send a message, this is what you would use. So at this time, there are 3 cities in this region, in the 7 cities that John is writing to, that even though Nero is dead, they still have coins circulating that have Nero's images on them. The cities are Ephesus, which is where the Agora is, Sardis, and Laodicea. So on those coins with Nero's name, it does not just say Nero, it has his full Latin name on it. And the full Latin name is Neron Caesar. So if you take gematria, if you take the numerical value of these letters in this order and you calculate it together and encode it, I'll give you one guess what the number is once you've done that. It is 666. All like the crazy like speculation and all of the things you've heard about this number, look, it is an ancient code that literally, when decoded, is about Nero. And so we can all just kind of relax anytime we see this number around. Next time you watch The Omen, just remember, like, it's made up. So if you, as if we're all just sitting around watching The Omen over and over again, but if you believed that Nero, the mortal enemy of your people, had died and come back to life, the last thing you would want is a written document with your name on it calling him a beast. That would probably not go over well, yeah? So this is like we're kind of in a Voldemort situation at this point, to where like, let's just avoid saying this guy's name at all costs, just in case he actually has resurrected from the dead and is coming for us all. So John goes way out of his way to avoid saying Nero's name. But here, he's using this numerical code. He talks about the beast with the fatal head wound. Like, clearly, he's talking about Nero without saying, like, he goes all the way around the block to not say the name Nero, but everybody understands, like, oh, this is definitely Nero. Like, there's no question in the minds of the early readers of this. So at its core, this whole chapter, this whole bananas chapter that lots of us have just probably like looked at and thought, like, I'm not even going to try and think about this because it's too weird. This whole chapter in the book of Revelation is about what happens when someone has been given some amount of power and have used it in really harmful, destructive ways. That's what this is about. A beast is anybody who takes power and uses it to harm somebody else. Human beings have an unbelievable capacity to abuse power. We've all seen it. We all know what it looks like when someone is handed a certain amount of power, they don't know what they're handling, and they end up doing lots of really harmful, really destructive things as a result of having had that power. And what John would say is, oh yeah, when somebody does that, they're becoming a beast. There's everyone who ever took Psychology 101 in college has probably heard this story already, but I'll go ahead and tell it. So several decades ago at Stanford University, there was a psychology professor named Philip Zimbardo. And Zimbardo conducted what has now famously been referred to as the Stanford Prison Experiment. And what they did, I mean, it's a long story, but the short version of it is Zimbardo wanted to see what would happen if they simulated a prison on campus. So during the summer months when most of the buildings were empty, they basically refurbished one of the basement level of one of the classroom buildings, and they set it up to be a makeshift prison. And so he had volunteers in the psychology department volunteered to come in, and they would either play the role of a prisoner or a guard. And they were randomly assigned. No psychological screening, no they did nothing more than just randomly assign, you're a guard, you're a prisoner, you're a guard, you're a prisoner. There was no other criteria by which they assigned one or the other. So the experiment was supposed to last about 2 weeks. It made it maybe 3 or 4 days before they had to shut the whole thing down. And here's why. Because it took less than a day for some of the students who were assigned the role of guard to begin both mentally and physically abusing certain the students who were assigned prisoner in ways that were so horrific that they had to stop the experiment early. So there's a whole documentary about this that's fascinating, and you can watch in the documentary. They bring these guys back together like years and years later, and they talk about the experience of having done this. And the ones, like specifically, there's one guy who was particularly targeted as a prisoner, and he talks about the experience like with such deep pain and trauma. Like, it took less than 3 days for someone who was randomly assigned one role that gave that person fake power over him. It took less than a day for that to become such a bad, toxic situation that they had to stop the whole thing before it was over. Why? And it was totally randomly selected. And it's not even real power. It's for an experiment, but it took no time at all for someone to have power and to become a beast and do all kinds of harm to somebody who was put under their power even in a fake simulated kind of way. So John in Revelation 13 is saying, look what happens when someone becomes obsessed with gaining more and more power. Look what happens when someone has all the power. And look how painful that can be to everybody who doesn't have that power. Nero was known as a power-hungry madman by the time he died, and that reputation continues to follow him long after he's dead. What happens when you become hungry for more and more power? John would say that eventually we are totally capable of becoming like a beast. As I become obsessed with power, I could become less and less human in how I interact with other people. And the problem is not just that a person has power. The problem is, how is that power used? Some of the harshest and most upsetting language in all of the scriptures are found inside the explorations of how people abuse and manipulate their own amount of power. So, of course, the question becomes, are there any counterexamples? Because John doesn't give us much of a counterexample. Basically, John is just acknowledging this is happening and it's bad, and we're all acknowledging that we're all trying to live under this, this umbrella of terror together is basically where John is. So the question becomes, if we move out of Revelation and we go looking for other examples, where will we find them? So to answer that, we're going to look at a different story about Jesus in Matthew 21. So during Jesus' life, Nero hasn't happened yet. When we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, the emperor at that time was a guy named Tiberius. So the problem, we talked about this earlier, the problem when you're emperor is you can't be everywhere at once. And so you need other people set up to rule in your place. And we've talked about how one of the people that Tiberius had was a guy named Herod. Another person that Tiberius used to control the people was a guy named Pontius Pilate. You probably heard of him. So basically, and Pilate was the governor of the Judean territory. Now, Pilate lived in a palace in a city called Caesarea. But one time a year, Pilate would leave Caesarea and go into the city of Jerusalem to send a message to the people about power. The time of year that he would choose to do this was right before what is referred to as Passover, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Why that time? Like, of all the times of year, why would Pilate want to go into Jerusalem and exercise his power specifically around Passover? Well, the reason is because Passover, and we talked about this at the very beginning of this series, Passover is a celebration of the story of the Exodus, which means it's the story of the people rising up and being liberated from a world power. At the time, it was Egypt. And so if your main holiday is telling the story about how you rose up and were freed from an oppressive world power and you live under the Roman Empire, it's possible that this holiday makes Pilate a little bit nervous, because some historians estimate that up to 200,000 Jewish men would gather in the city and around the temple at the time of Passover. That's a pretty good-sized army if you want it to be. And Pilate knows it. So if you're Pilate, you're feeling like, I need to make sure everybody understands what kind of power they're dealing with when they start talking about Passover. If you want to celebrate your liberation from another power, just remember, we are so much more powerful than Egypt ever was, is the message that Pilate needs to send. So Pilate's going to send a message every year right before Passover. So he has a giant parade leading into the city of Jerusalem, specifically from the west side of the city. I've drawn a very elaborate, detail-oriented map of the city of Jerusalem. So this is the city of Jerusalem. Pilate's coming in from the west side. And so Pilate comes in from the west, and he doesn't just step into the city. He's got a parade. He's got a whole situation going on. So it begins with someone riding on a chariot, which is an instrument of war, and the person in the chariot is holding a staff with an eagle mounted on the end of it. It looks like this. So, by the way, speaking of eagles as mascots of powerful countries. So the parade begins with a guy riding a chariot, carrying the staff with this eagle mounted on the end of it. The next thing that you will see in this parade is a visible retelling of major Roman victories throughout history, again, as a way of sort of non-verbally saying, we have put down and destroyed way more powerful groups of people than you. So then after that, you have a giant line of soldiers all carrying these massive metal shields, and they would bang their metal swords against the metal shields, which would create this deafening banging noise, this crashing noise that could be heard from miles away as a way to intimidate people before they even show up for battle. You want your enemies to feel intimidated and afraid before you even start the battle. So the next thing that you would have after the soldiers clanging on their shields were soldiers on horseback. Horses also were seen as instruments of war. And then at the end of the parade, you would also have Pilate riding on horseback. So the whole thing is a nonverbal message of, if you decide you want to recreate the story of Passover and rise up against a powerful empire, just know that we will destroy you, and this is how we'll do it. So the message here is, do not rise up. Do not start thinking that you're stronger than you are. So interestingly, there's one year where right after Pilate enters the city, Jesus also enters the city of Jerusalem. So look at Matthew 21. In Matthew 21, verse 5, it says, as they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there with her colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away. This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. Say to daughter Zion, which Zion is another way of talking about Israel, or Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Now, all of this, by the way, takes place on the east side of the city. So Pilate goes in from the west, and Jesus is about to go in from the east. And then it has this quote about, say, your king is coming, gentle and riding on a donkey. What's going on here? What is this quote about? So Matthew here is actually quoting from an ancient Hebrew prophet known as Zechariah. So one of the things that happens a lot in Hebrew dialogue is there's a practice called a remez. And what a remez is, you would, if you wanted to quote a passage from the scriptures, you wouldn't quote the whole thing. You would just quote one or two lines, and then the assumption was everybody listening to you is already familiar with what you're saying, so they will fill in the rest of it before you have to. So the memory does a lot of the work for them. So like, for example, if you were going to do this today, and you were trying to send a message to people who perhaps grew up in the 90s, you would say something. If I were to stand up here and say, in West Philadelphia, born and raised, there are those in the room who would say, like, oh, of course, a playground. That's where he spent most of his days. You know what I mean? And so, for those of you who don't know, it's from a well-known sitcom from the 1990s. Anyway, so you can probably find it on YouTube. So but the point, though, is you can say one thing, and what you're actually saying is all of it, just without verbalizing the entirety of it all. So when Matthew quotes this passage, he only talks about the donkey or the colt. But look at the passage from Zechariah that he's quoting. So it says in verse 9, it says, rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughters Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey, which again is a direct quote to what we see later. So, and then in verse 10, watch this. He says, I will take away the chariots from Ephraim. And Ephraim is another way of talking about Israel. I will take away the chariots from Ephraim and the war horses from Jerusalem, and the battle bow will be broken. So who has recently entered the city with chariots and war horses? Okay, so quoting this is not just a random quote. What's going on here? Matthew is connecting what Jesus is doing as a critique and subversion of what Pilate is doing. Jesus enters the city on a donkey from the east, by the way, as a way of showing the people that the way of Jesus and the way of Caesar are fundamentally at odds with one another. These two things do not function in the same way. Jesus is saying the other route into the city, the way Pilate comes into the city, that route wants to flex its muscles, and it wants people to feel small and intimidated and afraid. It wants to use its power to make itself bigger and everybody else smaller. That kind of power is the kind of thing that turns all of us into beasts. And Jesus is saying, I'm going to take a different route into the city. What is the whole message going on here? There are two ways to enter a city. You cannot control the beast. What you can control is whether or not you become one. Everyone you know, including yourself, has some amount of power. If you are alive in any kind of way, you have some amount of power right now. So the question this leaves us with is, do you know the power that you currently have? Are you even aware of how much power you already have? How you enter your home, how you enter your workspace, how you enter a difficult conversation with someone. All of that is reflective of how you see your power. There are two ways to enter a city. There are two ways to enter a conversation. There are two ways to step into the world around you. Which, by the way, watch how people interact with servers at restaurants. You've ever been to eat with somebody and they're just like mean and verbally abusive to the person who's just doing their job and trying to bring your food? Which, by the way, maybe not a great idea to antagonize the person who can tamper with your food while you're not looking at it, but I'm just, that in and of itself is also a way of using power. But like, watch how somebody uses power when they have it, even if it's just a little bit for a little bit of time, then it becomes clear like, oh, like this is a person who very easily could enter the world, enter a city in really harmful, beastly kinds of ways. It is possible to take the power that I have and to become like a beast. It is possible for me to engage with other people in ways that make them feel afraid or small or disempowered. In my other job, the non-preaching job that I have a lot of power. I don't have all the power, but I have more power than a lot of the people that I work with, and I'm aware of that. And I have to, every single day, I have to interact. Every time I have an interaction with somebody, there has to be at least one fraction of my brain that understands that I am in a situation where I have more power than the person I'm talking to. And my tone is going to be important. And what I say, how I say it, what I expect, what I don't expect, how I follow up with this conversation, all of this is reflective in how I understand my own power. I have to engage understanding that if I abuse this, I can become quite easily like a beast. And I don't want that. There's two ways to enter a city, and I'd like to do it in the way that Jesus calls us to. So the first question is, do you understand what power you have? The second question is, what are you going to do with your power? What are you already doing with your power? The Greek word here, by the way, for power is the word dunamis. It's literally where we get the word dynamite. Do you know what kind of explosive material you are handling when you are handling your own power? Do you understand what you can do with this power, whether you should do it or not? Do you know what kind of power you're handling? Do you know how much destruction you could cause if you chose to? Or if you just stopped thinking about it and just started acting on instinct and didn't think about, I'm handling something pretty powerful and pretty explosive, and I need to be aware of that. Conversely, do you know how much good you could bring into the world if you decided to? Do you know how much power, how powerful it is to show kindness or to offer compassion or generosity to somebody else? Do you know how different it is to enter a city from that direction than from a I am more powerful than you, don't you know who I am kind of place? We are all capable of becoming beasts. Nero is not unique. Nero is the norm. We are all capable of becoming like this, of becoming less and less human in how we interact with others, because that's what it means to have power. We are all capable of becoming more human and using our power to bring life and goodness and love and peace and joy into the world. You have the power to do either of those things. There's two ways to enter a city. So may you enter every space with a spirit of grace and peace and love and humility. May you enter every space from a place of, what does it look like for me to use this power that I have to bring goodness into the world? I want to invite the ushers to come up. We're going to go ahead and take communion. Communion is this beautiful picture of how does Jesus use his power? Well, communion shows us that Jesus breaks himself open and pours himself out. Power for Jesus is a thing that is only useful when he chooses to give it away and when he chooses to use it to bring life into the world. So for those of us who have power and perhaps aren't aware of how we're using our power, may we take a hard, long look in the mirror and really ask questions about, am I using my power in good ways? What kind of dynamite am I handling? And am I using it in a way that actually can bring life to the world? And for those of us who have been on the negative receiving end of somebody else's power, may we heal from those wounds. May we choose to recognize what that was and to move forward. And may we choose to never become the beast that was inflicted on us.